1:17 a.m. Strait of Hormuz. The narrowest navigable passage is 33 kilometers wide at the point where the international shipping lanes converge between the Omani coast and the Iranian island of Qeshm. Through that 33-kilometer window, approximately 21 million barrels of crude oil transit every day, roughly 21% of global petroleum consumption moving in tankers whose beam alone exceeds 60 meters. The strait is not a choke point in the theoretical sense. It is a choke point in the mathematical sense. There is no alternative route. There is no bypass. Anything that closes the strait closes a fifth of the world's oil supply within hours. The IRGC Navy had understood this arithmetic for 4 decades. Its doctrine for strait denial had been developed, revised, exercised, and updated through every cycle of regional tension since 1988. The doctrine was not primitive. It was layered, adaptive, and built around a fundamental asymmetry. Closing the strait required significantly less investment than keeping it open. A naval mine costs between $1,500 and $15,000 depending on its sophistication. A minesweeping operation to clear a minefield in a contested 33-kilometer passage under the risk of follow-on mining costs orders of magnitude more in time, equipment, and risk. The IRGC's planners had spent 40 years developing a doctrine around that asymmetry. At 1:17 a.m., that doctrine was activating. The trigger had been a U.S. Treasury designation 48 hours earlier. A sanctions package targeting 11 Iranian front companies involved in petroleum export through third-party intermediaries. The designation was routine in its legal construction. In its timing, it coincided with the final week of an Iranian government fiscal quarter during which the petroleum revenue those intermediaries processed represented the difference between a budget surplus and a structural deficit. The IRGC hardline faction within the Supreme National Security Council had assessed the designation not as a routine enforcement action, but as a deliberate economic pressure operation timed to maximize fiscal damage. Their response proposal had been approved at the highest level within 36 hours. The plan was not a missile salvo. It was a denial operation. Simultaneous mining of the internationally designated shipping lanes at 3 separate points in the strait, combined with an anti-ship missile and drone swarm targeting the 3 commercial tankers currently transiting the northern lane under informal U.S. Navy escort. Not to sink the tankers, to damage them sufficiently to create a transit stoppage. A stopped tanker in the 33-kilometer passage is more effective as a blocking mechanism than a sunken one. A damaged tanker that requires assistance creates exactly the traffic management crisis that the doctrine was designed to produce. The insurance markets would do the rest. Lloyd's of London had a standing escalation clause for Strait of Hormuz operations. If even 2 transits were suspended pending security assessment, the clause would activate within hours. Every tanker company operating in the Gulf would receive the same message from their underwriters at approximately the same time. IRGC Navy fast boat teams had been pre-positioned for 72 hours in the shallow water approaches to Qeshm Island under cover of a fishing protection exercise, a designation that legitimized the presence of high-speed vessels in the strait's northern approach corridor. At 1:17:03 a.m., those teams began deploying SADAF bottom-influence mines from the fast boats in 3 separate clusters, each cluster positioned in the center of one of the 2 internationally designated traffic separation scheme lanes. 31 mines total across 3 clusters. The mines were acoustic and magnetic influence types. They would not detonate on the first vessel crossing, but would arm progressively and select a target based on a signature matching protocol designed to prioritize large displacement tanker hulls, simultaneously from launch positions along the Iranian coast between Bandar Abbas and the Qeshm Naval Facility. IRGC Navy missile boats and shore batteries activated. 12 Noor anti-ship cruise missiles targeted at the 3 tankers in the northern shipping lane, interspersed with 47 Shahed 136 one-way drone systems targeted at the vessel's deck structures and bridge sections. Not the engine rooms, not the hull below the waterline, the bridge structures, disabling navigation control without sinking the vessels, creating exactly the kind of helpless traffic-blocking obstruction the doctrine required. The space-based infrared system was watching. At 1:17:08 a.m., the SBIRS constellation registered the fast boat thermal signatures intensifying in the Keshem shallow water area. Not a launch plume, but the elevated engine output consistent with high-speed maneuvering under operational conditions. 5 seconds later, the Noor anti-ship missile launch signatures registered from the Bandar Abbas coastal battery positions. The SBIRS analyst covering the Persian Gulf sector had been monitoring the IRGC Navy exercise signatures for 72 hours. At 1:17:19 a.m., the signatures resolved from exercise consistent to engagement consistent. She flagged the mine deployment inference. The fast boat pattern was consistent with the IRGC mine-laying doctrine profile in the intelligence database and initiated the dual alert at 1:17:26 a.m. 9 seconds from first signature to alert, the data reached NAVCENT, the 5th Fleet Headquarters at NSA Bahrain, and USS Baton's Combat Operations Center simultaneously at 1:17:38 a.m. 30 seconds from the first IRGC mine deployment to full U.S. Naval Command awareness across the theater. The response architecture that activated at 1:17:38 a.m. had been maintained at NAVCENT for 27 months under the contingency designation Strait Guardian. It covered 2 simultaneous problems that conventional naval doctrine did not typically combine: anti-ship missile and drone defense for the commercial vessels under escort, and mine countermeasure response for a contested strait passage. They were different problems requiring different assets operating in different domains simultaneously. The anti-ship and drone defense problem was the more immediate. 12 Noor cruise missiles and 47 Shahed 136 drones were inbound toward 3 commercial tankers operating in the northern shipping lane. The tankers, a 300,000 deadweight ton crude carrier, a 180,000-ton product tanker, and a 95,000-ton LNG carrier, had been transiting under escort by USS Paul Hamilton, an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer assigned to the Bahrain-based escort duty rotation. USS Paul Hamilton had been conducting this escort rotation for 11 days. It had been at heightened readiness since the Treasury designation 48 hours earlier. USS Paul Hamilton's Aegis system acquired the Noor missile tracks at 1:17:44 a.m., 6 seconds after the NAVCENT alert, before the missiles had reached their midpoint. SM-2 Block 3B missiles launched against the first wave of Noor tracks at 1:18:02 a.m. The Noor anti-ship cruise missile flies at sea-skimming altitude, 5 to 10 meters above the water surface, which compresses the radar detection geometry and reduces the SM-2's engagement timeline relative to a higher altitude target. USS Paul Hamilton's fire control system tracked 9 of 12 Noor tracks cleanly from initial detection. 3 were lost behind the radar shadow of the LNG carrier's hull at certain approach angles. The SM-2 engagement achieved 9 intercepts between 1:18:02 and 1:18:47 a.m. The 3 tracks that had been briefly masked reacquired at 1:18:31 a.m. and were engaged by rolling airframe missiles at closer range. 2 were intercepted by RAM. 1 Noor missile impacted the crude carrier's portside midship section at 1:18:54 a.m. The warhead penetrated to the cargo deck level before detonation. The resulting structural damage was confined to a cargo tank space that was at the time partially empty on the ballast leg. The vessel's structural integrity was not compromised. Navigation systems were undamaged. The crude carrier reported in at 1:19:11 a.m. damaged, cargo tank breach underway and steerable. The drone swarm was the more complex defensive problem. 47 Shahed 136 systems dispersed across a 40-kilometer front, flying at 185 meters altitude and targeting the tanker's bridge structures. USS Paul Hamilton's CIWS system and the CRAM installed during a refit 14 months earlier were optimized for this engagement profile. CIWS opened engagement at 1:18:19 a.m. against the leading drone elements. CRAM engaged the flanking elements. Combined engagement rate across both systems: 31 drone intercepts between 1:18:19 and 1:21:03 a.m. 16 drones penetrated past the close-in defense envelope. The escort doctrine for commercial vessel protection in this contested environment did not place USS Paul Hamilton between the drones and the tankers. A single destroyer screening 3 large tankers against a 40-kilometer front drone swarm was geometrically impossible. The doctrine placed USS Paul Hamilton as a suppression platform and relied on the commercial vessel's own countermeasures: chaff, decoy flares, and the structural hardening requirements that had been incorporated into Gulf Transit Tanker Certification Standards since 2019 to handle the leakers. Of 16 penetrating drones, 11 were defeated by tanker countermeasures or impacted non-critical superstructure areas. 5 reached their intended aim points. The crude carrier's bridge structure sustained 2 impacts. Navigation radar rendered inoperable. Primary helm control damaged, emergency helm remaining functional. The product tanker sustained 1 bridge impact, communications equipment rendered inoperable, navigation systems intact. The LNG carrier sustained 2 impacts on its forward deck structure. No critical systems damaged. All 3 vessels remained afloat, steerable on emergency systems and capable of controlled movement. None were able to transit independently at commercial speed. 3 damaged tankers, stationary or near stationary in the Strait of Hormuz's northern shipping lane, each requiring assistance. The mine threat had not yet been addressed. The strait was, for the first time since 1988, functionally closed to commercial traffic. The broader regional response to the strait closure was visible within 40 minutes of the first IRGC action. 3 tankers in queue at Fujairah anchorage, awaiting a scheduled transit slot, received hold orders from their operators at 1:48 a.m., following the first maritime security advisory issued by NAVCENT. 2 additional tankers already underway in the Gulf of Oman reversed course and anchored in the outer approaches. The Commercial Maritime Notification System, the maritime security communications with industry channel maintained by UKMTO in Dubai, issued a formal advisory at 1:53 a.m. classifying the strait as a restricted transit zone pending security assessment. By 2:15 a.m., 22 vessels had received hold orders from their operators or underwriters. The Strait of Hormuz had moved from contested to suspended operationally 48 minutes after the first mine entered the water. The IRGC's doctrine had operated on the correct premise. The mine did not need to detonate to close the passage. The mine needed only to exist and be known to exist. The mine countermeasure response had been activating in parallel since 1:17:38 a.m. This was the second problem: slower, more complex, and ultimately more determinative of whether the strait reopened in hours or weeks. NAVCENT had pre-positioned 2 Avenger-class mine countermeasure vessels at Fujairah port on the UAE coast as part of the Strait Guardian posture adjustment implemented 48 hours earlier. USS Pioneer and USS Devastator had gotten underway at 1:22 a.m. Transit time from Fujairah to the mine cluster positions in the strait, approximately 90 minutes at 14 knots. The mine countermeasure timeline was not a 60-minute problem. It was a multi-hour operation that would begin while the rest of the response was still executing. The IRGC fast boats that had deployed the mines were still operating in the Keshem shallow water area at 1:20 a.m., repositioning for a potential second mine deployment sequence if the first clusters were cleared. U.S. Navy MH-60R helicopters from USS Bataan had been airborne since the NAVCENT alert. At 1:23:14 a.m., two MH-60Rs acquired the fast boat formation on their surveillance radar at 14 kilometers range and identified the mine-laying equipment still aboard two of the 12 fast boats. The engagement decision was authorized at 1:23:44 a.m., 30 seconds after acquisition. The fast boats were IRGC naval vessels conducting a mine warfare operation against internationally designated shipping lanes in international waters. The engagement authority under the Strait Guardian rules of engagement had been pre-delegated to the on-scene commander for exactly this contingency. A GM-114 Hellfire missiles from the MH-60Rs engaged the two mine-equipped fast boats at 1:24:03 a.m. Both boats were rendered non-operational. The remaining 10 fast boats dispersed at maximum speed toward Keshim Island's territorial water boundary. They were tracked by the MH-60Rs but not engaged once they crossed into Iranian territorial waters at 1:26:18 a.m. The IRGC shore-based missile battery at Bandar Abbas that had launched the Noor missiles was engaged at 1:31 a.m. by AARGM-ER missiles from F/A-18E Super Hornets launched from USS Dwight D. Eisenhower operating in the Gulf of Oman east of the strait. The battery's fire control radar had remained active after the initial launch, tracking USS Paul Hamilton and assessing targeting solutions for a second salvo. The active radar made it a targetable emitter under the Strait Guardian engagement protocol. Two AARGM-ER missiles launched at 1:28:47 a.m. The battery radar went offline at 1:31:14 a.m. No second Noor salvo was launched. By 2:09 a.m., 52 minutes after the first IRGC action, the immediate tactical picture had stabilized. The Noor and Shahed engagement was complete. The three tankers were damaged but afloat and controlled. The mine-deploying fast boats had been neutralized or dispersed. The Bandar Abbas battery was non-operational. The mines themselves, 31 SADAF influence mines in 3 clusters across the shipping lanes, remained in position. They would remain in position until the Avenger-class vessels arrived and the clearing operation began. USS Pioneer and USS Devastator reached the first mine cluster at 2:51 a.m. The mine clearing operation using AN/SQQ-32 sonar and SLQ-48 mine neutralization systems began at 2:58 a.m. Clearing rate for influence mines in a 200-meter wide lane section, approximately 3 to 4 mines per hour under operational conditions. 31 mines across 3 clusters. Estimated clearing time to restore 1 navigable lane, 11 to 14 hours. The strait would not reopen to commercial traffic before mid-afternoon. The mine clearing operation was the irreducible constraint. Ordnance expenditure could be restocked. Damaged vessels could be repaired. The mines in the water required time, measured in hours per cluster, not minutes, and no amount of additional assets could compress that timeline below its physical lower bound. The pace was set by the sonar sweep geometry, not by the operational urgency of the command chain above it. The insurance market response was faster than the clearing operation. At 3:14 a.m., Lloyd's of London's Joint War Committee activated its Strait of Hormuz escalation clause. By 4 a.m., 7 major tanker operators had suspended dispatch of vessels to Gulf loading terminals pending security assessment. The global crude futures market registered a 7.3% price increase in the first 30 minutes of Asian trading following the news, the largest single-session move in 14 months. The IRGC's doctrine had calculated this outcome correctly. A mine threat plus 3 damaged tankers plus insurance escalation produced a commercial transit suspension faster than any kinetic operation could have achieved. What the doctrine had not calculated was the 48-hour timeline. The pre-positioning of USS Pioneer and USS Devastator at Fujairah. The MH-60R airborne alert that placed helicopters over the deployment area within 6 minutes. The AARGMER engagement authority pre-delegated to the on-scene commander. These were not reactive improvisations to the IRGC operation. They were elements of a posture that had been established because the intelligence picture had been sufficiently clear for 48 hours to allow pre-positioning without public announcement. Total U.S. and coalition assets committed to Strait Guardian response. USS Paul Hamilton escort defense, 2 MH-60R helicopters, 4 FA-18E aircraft from USS Eisenhower, 2 Avenger-class MCM vessels. Commercial tankers damaged, 3. U.S. personnel injuries, 0. IRGC fast boats rendering non-operational, 2. Bandar Abbas battery non-operational. IRGC Noor missiles launched, 12. Intercepted, 11. 1 impact, non-critical damage. Shade drones launched, 47. Intercepted or defeated, 42. 5 bridge area impacts, no vessels lost. Strait operational status. Restricted 1 lane clearing in progress, estimated full restoration 14 hours. Insurance escalation clause, active. Commercial transit suspension, 7 operators expanding. Crude futures price movement, plus 7.3% at Asian Open. At 6 a.m., the first P-8A Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft arrived on station above the clearing operation, providing acoustic sensor coverage that supplemented the Avenger vessel's own sonar systems and allowed the mine detection geometry to be extended beyond the immediate sweep corridor. The P-8A's multi-static acoustic processing identified 4 additional mine contacts in the eastern margin of Cluster 2 that had not been within the Avenger's initial sonar coverage arc. The revised mine count, 35, not 31, extended the clearing timeline estimate by approximately 90 minutes. The Maritime Coordination Authority at Dubai was notified at 6:22 a.m. The transit hold advisory was extended accordingly. The IRGC operation had not been defeated in the traditional sense of the word. 3 tankers had been damaged. The strait had been closed for a working day. The insurance markets had moved. The commercial disruption was real and measurable. What the operation had not achieved was permanence. The mine-clearing operation was running on schedule. The damaged tankers were under tow to anchorage. The Bandar Abbas battery would not launch a second salvo. The fast boats were back at Keshim, without their mine inventory and without the radar coverage that would tell their commanders where the Avenger-class vessels were operating. By 3:41 p.m. the following day, the first cleared lane was certified navigable by USS Pioneer's mine warfare officer. The certification was transmitted to NAVCENT at 3:41:22 p.m. and forwarded to the Maritime Coordination Authority at Dubai at 3:42:07 p.m. The first tanker resumed transit at 4:19 p.m., a 180,000-ton product tanker whose bridge structure repairs had been completed at anchorage by a damage control team transferred from USS Baton at 7 a.m. The transit took 4 hours and 11 minutes through the cleared lane, with MH-60R escort overhead and USS Paul Hamilton holding station at the lane entrance. The insurance escalation clause remained active for 72 hours after resumption, then was suspended pending the mine clearance certificate for the 2nd and 3rd clusters. The strait had been closed for 14 hours and 22 minutes. The 31 mines had cost the IRGC approximately $340,000 in procurement. The response that cleared them, protected the vessels, and restored the passage had cost $47 million in ordnance, fuel, and operational expenditure. The exchange ratio was 1 to 138 in the IRGC's favor on direct cost. The commercial disruption, 14 hours of transit suspension, the insurance market movement, the crude futures spike, had produced economic effects that no missile salvo could have generated at equivalent cost. The mine remained the most cost-asymmetric instrument in the IRGC Navy's inventory. The response to it was slower, more expensive, and less decisive than the response to a ballistic missile. What the response had demonstrated was something different from the other domains. It had demonstrated that the pre-positioning decision made 48 hours earlier, the quiet movement of 2 mine countermeasure vessels to Fujairah without announcement, was the operational action that had bounded the disruption to 14 hours rather than 14 days. The intelligence had been clear enough to act on. The action had been taken. The strait had closed and reopened. The arithmetic of the passage ran again at 4:19 p.m., as it had run every day for the preceding 40 years.